Welcome, Meg. I've had the great privilege of doing research on Cittamani, and it was with great pleasure that I could publish the findings that show that Cittamani Hospice provides enormous support for people going through the hospice and the bereavement experience, and has very positive outcomes for people in how they deal with their loss of a loved one. Do you want to talk a little bit about Cittamani's service?
Yes, there's a couple different factors in our bereavement program, a couple different components rather. Probably the bulk of our bereavement support is offered over the phone, so we can have anywhere up to 250 people in our bereavement program or accessing bereavement support through Cittamani at any one time. And so we have our bereavement team will give people a phone call, and how often that happens depends upon the person, what their needs are. But we try to contact people once a month. Sometimes it's once a week if they're really struggling. Sometimes it can be every couple months, a bit further down the track, depending upon where people are and how they're moving. We also have face-to-face conversations with people if they'd like that, and those can be at people's homes or they can be here at Cittamani. And then we also have bereavement support groups. We have 2 bereavement support groups a month, and those are open to anyone in the community can come along. And those groups are really about people coming together that have been through something similar, and they're informal. We sit around, have a cup of tea. It's very an easygoing atmosphere, but it's a chance for people to kind of come to share their stories. It's not about fixing anything. It's just about people telling where they're up to on the day, and
Yeah, excellent. What in your work do you find people most like to talk about and address when they talk to you?
Well, it kind of depends upon where they're up to. Initially, I think we talk a lot about practical things. People, check in and see how they're going with really simple things like getting meals for themselves, how they're going with their exercise, if they're feeling pretty flat, just some kind of basic day-to-day things, their sleep, their diet. And I guess also initially people will talk about settling the estate. So there's a lot of financial things to sort out, and that can be a bit tricky for people. It also can be very emotionally draining. And people will often then talk about family stuff. So these days there's a lot of blended families. So if Mary's husband John dies, John might have kids from a previous relationship, and sometimes those relationships are lovely, and other times they're not as lovely, and things don't always go as smooth. So there can be a lot of angst sometimes after somebody dies that changes relationships and families, and so people will talk a lot about that. And I guess also as people move through, especially in bereavement support group, we can talk about different things when people are a little bit further down the track. We might talk about how people are feeling very flat and how, they're getting through the day-to-day stuff. By that time they've established their routine, they're back kind of in their usual spot, but there's no motivation to do anything else, so they can't be bothered kind of getting out into the garden or going back to their reading group or their volunteer work or whatever it is. So those conversations can kind of encompass lots of different things.
There's often quite unrealistic expectations about how long people grieve. What's your experience and thought about this with the people you work with?
Yes, society's not very kind about this.
Yeah.
Often hear people say, "Oh, you're still doing that," or "You haven't done that yet. You haven't taken the clothes out of the closet yet. They're still hanging here." So I think people are quite surprised at how long actually it takes them to kind of get through things. And actually, people will often say to me, you never get over it, you never get over grief, you simply get through it. So people get better about kind of adjusting their lives to this new situation. So there's really no timeline. I think there was some phases of grief, and people thought they needed to move through the phase, and once they were angry, then they would move to bargaining or acceptance or whatever. And that's a little bit, it isn't actually how it works.
What issues do you find most surprise people about their experience with grief?
I think people are surprised about the depth of what they feel and the intensity of the feelings that they feel. And we just mentioned how long, grief goes for, or sort of not ever having an end to that. I think people are surprised at that. Some people will say that they've grieved a bit before, maybe around diagnosis time or the time leading up to the death. And there's no doubt that they haven't grieved. That there's a grieving process that happens, but there's still a different kind of grief, I think, that happens after somebody dies and they're no longer physically there with you. So people are surprised about the depth and the intensity. I think they're also surprised if they have an idea about how they should be grieving and they're not following that, So someone might ring in and say, it's been 6 months and I haven't cried yet. And they'll kind of whisper it like they're very embarrassed about that fact. When actually, I talk to a lot of people that haven't cried at the 6-month mark or up until that mark, and that's quite okay. Sometimes there's other things that people do that maybe are a little bit less common, like the other day having a conversation with someone that's having a hard time swallowing. And I've heard lots of people say that after a loved one close to them dies, they have a hard time being around food and eating, and so they find that they can't get anything down. And that's not an unusual thing. There's actually also been some research about that for diabetics, that their blood sugar is affected while they're grieving. There's been some physical research about that. So, people might not be aware of that, and they might think that something's drastically wrong when actually it's grief. And so not to minimize what grief's doing, but also not to say that there's something really out of the ordinary happening. It's a very natural process, and it will right itself eventually.
Could you talk about the different things that people find helpful in dealing with their grief?
Yes, I think in your research, a couple of years ago really highlighted those things that people find helpful, and it was a nice way of kind of formalizing what we've always thought. But people find the support of family and friends helpful, and some of that is more helpful than others. People also find that connecting with other people. So they might not feel very good about or comfortable going out socially, but they might find that it's easy to go out with one person and have a coffee, whereas they don't like to go into a large group of people. They might also find that it's helpful to get back to their volunteer work if it was something they were doing before their loved one died. But they find that it's very hard to start something new. So, you talk about what's helpful, what's unhelpful. They don't like people pressuring them to do things. They'll do it in their own time. And I guess it's also being understanding. Grief is very chaotic. So a friend might ring up and say, do you want to come to dinner? And the person might say no. And they might ask them religiously every week for 6 weeks and then just give up. But actually, you need to hang in there as a friend. You need to ring 6 months down the track and say, do you want to come to dinner now? Or if you don't want to come to dinner, would you rather go for a walk? So it's being a little bit flexible. So I think people appreciate family and friends that are really understanding, and they appreciate the connections they make in groups. And they also appreciate the connection they have with their health professionals, with GPs, GP checking in with them. Having a social worker, a psychologist, a counselor sometimes is helpful for some people, not for everybody. People might get support through their church. So, I think they also need to keep busy. So people like things to do. They like that busyness and that activity.
People sometimes talk about getting over their grief. How does that idea sit with you with what you're trying to achieve with the bereavement program?
Yes, well, I think, as I said before, it's more about getting through it, and that I've heard other people say that they need to find a new normal, that they need to find a new way of being, because their old way is not, if they were married to someone for 35 years and that person's no longer there, they aren't going to be the same person after that person has died. So that's probably one of the biggest challenges people that are grieving find, is adjusting to that new way of being. And that means they need to figure out a way to stay connected to the person that's died. So they have to think, well, that person's not here with me physically. How am I going to stay connected to them now in a spiritual way? Or am I going to talk to them every morning? Am I going to kiss their photo? Am I going to go to the cemetery, the crematorium, whatever it is, however they stay connected. Sometimes it's having conversations about them with their loved ones, or with, if John used to golf with his mates, maybe she goes and has a chat with the golf mates about what they're doing, just to stay that connected to him in some way. So I think as far as getting over grief, it doesn't really happen. I think people get through it, and they do that in their own way and in their own time.
Thank you for that, Meg. No, it is a genuine thank you. You just spoke beautifully. That was a real help. I can really see why the research highlights that your service is providing so much benefit for those who are facing the significant loss of a loved one.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.